Okay, it's 7:01.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. And my name is Mervyn Russell. I'm a retired member of the Order of the Ordained Ministry of the United Church of Canada. And I continue to be a member on the roll of the British Methodist Church, in which I was formed spiritually. But at present, I attend St. John's United Church in Oakville. First of all, I'm going to give a recognition of the land on which I am present. And if you care to think about the land that you own and the traditional trustees of that land, please think about that whilst I'm speaking. I recognize that I and many others on this webinar are living on the lands and the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and that there have been at various times also others like the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee peoples who've also lived on this land. We acknowledge that all the prosperity of our settler society enjoys is based on the resources which were used by these first inhabitants of North America and from whom settler society claimed them as their own. We commit ourselves to pray and act to develop, respect, knowledge, and justice and reconciliation between our two peoples. So this program is the second of a series of three illustrated presentations that are going to be given by retired Professor Dan Epp-Tiessen of the Central Mennonite University in Winnipeg. I will introduce Dan more fully a little later. After I've introduced Dan, he's going to give a 40-minute presentation, which is illustrated to help us understand and get things more clearly into our minds. And if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question during Dan's presentation, you can do it two ways. You can either raise your hand. There's a raised hand function in the reactions box, which again you'll find at the bottom, the center at the bottom of your screen, or you can put a comment into the chat. Whether or you're writing or whether you're speaking, please try to be concise and, of course, polite. It's very pleasing to see everybody's faces and to hear their voices. And if you are not quite sure how to do that, to be heard, just click on the microphone at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, or and to be seen on the video camera. But if you want to be, as I've said, incognito, well, that's perfectly all right as well. So the role of so-called Christian Zionism in the founding of the development of the state of Israel is an important one, both in the past and in the present. For members of Christian communities, it's important that they know this history and decide for themselves if they think it's commendable or reprehensible. And Professor Dan Epp-Tiessen will help us to understand what the issues have been and are to this day. Now, I thought rather than just give a more formal introduction to Dan, I'd like to ask him a question. And so, Dan, I wonder if you'd be willing to tell us how it was that you got involved in this particular issue.
Uh, the answer is a little bit strange. I married into it.
Okay.
Uh, so when I married Esther, Her father had been involved in this issue already in the 1960s and the 70s, and he was speaking and writing. He wrote a book, Whose Land is Palestine, arguing that Palestinians had a right to the land. So he was way, way ahead of his time. And on one of his research trips to the Middle East, he took Esther and her sister along. So at age 15, she's in the refugee camps, the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and such, and they're interviewing PLO leaders, Palestine Liberation Organization leaders, and the like. And so I married into the issue. And then when I did my studies in Bible, it's just a kind of dovetailing of uh, Palestine, Zionism issues, and the biblical story. So that's sort of the short answer.
Okay, okay. Well, that is very interesting, and oftentimes I think we do get involved in these issues through some kind of personal uh,
Mhm.
contact. Now,
Mm.
how has the Mennonite community responded to this issue?
We're all over the map. There's plenty of Mennonites who are strong Christian Zionists, who support the state of Israel no matter what. And there are lots of Mennonite folks that would be very much anti-Zionist and very supportive of justice for Palestinians. So it's all over the map.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
has your involvement caused you any difficulties at all?
No, I lead a sheltered life, so most of the people I connect with agree with me. So I've had surprisingly little blowback. I'm expecting. I'm actually doing this set of webinars. Well, I'm doing it 3 different times in October and November, and so I'm expecting some pushback, but not from this group, of course.
Well, yeah, I'm delighted to hear that you are doing them in other settings as well. You put together very good presentations here. So just to give a little bit of Dan's kind of academic background, he received his PhD from St. Michael's College, Toronto in 1994. He's been a lecturer at various seminaries in southwestern Ontario. He's taught Bible and theology from 1988 to 2023, first as an assistant professor and then as an adjunct professor at the Central Mennonite University in Winnipeg. He's published 2 books on Hebrew prophets and has written many articles, reviews, and resources on topics such as the resurrection, homosexuality, and Palestinian rights. So, having said all that, Dan, it's over to you, and we look forward to what you have to share with us this evening.
Okay, thanks, Mervyn. Thanks. Okay, so how did we get from the Bible to genocide in Gaza? And we're following 3 different avenues. So last week, we followed the avenue of the Bible's land promises. Today, the avenue that we're going to follow is the New Testament passages that are very critical of Jewish people, Jewish leaders. And we're going to trace how the church's theologians built a vicious anti-Semitic theology out of those passages, and how that Christian anti-Semitism eventually led or was a significant factor in the formation of the modern state of Israel. And so it was the formation of the modern state of Israel that led to the dispossession of Palestinians, which led to Palestinian resistance, which led to Hamas, which led to October 7th, which led to the genocide that followed. Okay, here's the definition of anti-Semitism that I use. I'm not going to get into details. There's the whole issue of how to define anti-Semitism is a highly contested issue. We don't need to go there. But this is the definition that's typically used in genocide studies and anti-Semitism studies. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to outline a bunch of bold claims about Christian anti-Semitism, and then we're going to double back and unpack these claims. So, claim number one, here we go. Um, that European anti-Semitism started within the church. It started early in the church's history and in the first 5 centuries, and then it spread all across Western Europe and even to other places in the world. That early Christian anti-Semitism made use of New Testament passages that are critical of Jewish people and their leaders. And this anti-Semitism, it demonized Jews in multiple ways. It became central to Christian theology, and that led to centuries and centuries of absolutely horrific persecution of Jewish people. And the hatred and fear of Jews that this Christian anti-Semitism created, it became so sort of deeply ingrained in European culture that even when European culture became secular, the anti-Semitism survived. Or that the hatred and fear of Jews survived, but it became secularized. And so, in a sense, Christian anti-Semitism evolved into secular anti-Semitism. So all of those, number five here, all of those years of Christian anti-Semitism and Jew hatred sort of prepared the way for the emergence of really virulent secular forms of anti-Semitism in the 19th and 20th century. And as we know, that secular anti-Semitism culminated in the Holocaust. Now, the Nazis were not Christians, but they would not have been able to create the kind of level of Jew hatred necessary to carry out the Holocaust had Christian anti-Semitism not been sort of poisoning the European heart and mind towards Jews for many, many centuries. So, in that sense, that Christian anti-Semitism is in very significant ways responsible for uh, the Holocaust. Now, the anti-Semitism that made Europe unsafe for Jews, in the late 1800s, the Zionist movement came into being as a response in some ways to this anti-Semitism. And the Zionists argued that we Jews, we are not safe in Europe. We must move to Palestine and create our own Jewish state there. And this Jewish state will be a safe haven for persecuted Jews anywhere in the world. So, okay, so, and then the Holocaust comes along. And it marks a watershed, first of all, in the Jewish community, because up until the Holocaust, very, very few Jewish people were supportive of the Zionist cause. But after the Holocaust, the Zionists had proved correct. Europe was not safe for Jews. And the formation of the State of Israel was seen as a solution to now we Jewish people will have our land of refuge. So, since the Holocaust, there's been a process whereby for many, many Jews today, Zionism and the State of Israel are just inseparable from their Jewish identity. But that development is a product of the Holocaust. Okay, the horrors of the Holocaust also changed Western political perspectives because after the Holocaust, there's a kind of guilt that sets in Western nations. I mean, prior to the Holocaust, there was a boatload of Jewish refugees that tried to get into the U.S. and Canada in 1939. Both U.S. and Canada turned them away. They had to go back to Europe because of the flagrant anti-Semitism in Canada and U.S. After the Holocaust, Western perspective changes. And so the Western nations vote at the United Nations in favor of allowing the Zionists to create a Jewish state in Palestine. And this was a way for the Western nations to assuage their guilt, um, and it didn't cost them anything. You could solve the sort of Jewish problem in somebody else's neighborhood. Um, and since 1948, uh, this deep, deep fear of anti-Semitism and another Holocaust led the new Zionist state of Israel uh, to try and get rid of its Palestinians. And so there was this massive program of ethnic cleansing, taking the land from Palestinians, destroying their homes, forcing 750,000 of them outside the land of Israel. Um, and there's just been this ongoing land grab by Israel and pushing Palestinians out. Um, so today, um, the accusation of anti-Semitism is often leveled against individuals, movement groups that are advocating on behalf of justice for Palestinians. So the accusation of anti-Semitism, it gets weaponized in order to discredit and shut down critiques of.
Uh, you're silent, Dan.
Pardon me?
Okay, we couldn't hear you.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. So these are the bold claims that I'm now going to unpack. And I'm going to start at a bit of we're going to start by, okay, so how did Christian anti-Semitic theology develop? And I'm going to start at a bit of an odd place, roughly the year 400, with John Chrysostom, who became the Archbishop of Constantinople. And while he was still only a bishop in the city of Antioch, he preached a series of 8 sermons against the Jews. And those sermons were laced with these kinds of diatribes. Jews sacrifice their children to Satan. The synagogue is a brothel, a temple of demons. Um, this kind of language. When animals are unfit for work, we slaughter them. And that's what's happened to the Jews. And that's why Christ said, ask for my enemies, bring them here and slay them before me. I mean, what John Chrysostom is calling for here is, in a sense, genocide of the Jewish people. I hate the Jews. I hate the synagogue. It is the duty of all Christians to hate the Jews. And this is but a small sample of the kind of stuff that he was preaching, and he was not alone. He may have been one of the worst, but there were many, many other Christian preachers, theologians that were saying these same kinds of things. How does this happen? Um, Well, what happened is that these theologians of the early church, they latched onto certain types of New Testament passages, and then they used these passages to build an entire anti-Semitic theology. So we're going to look at a few of those passages from the New Testament. These kinds of passages from the Gospel of Matthew, where there are a whole series of, Jesus pronounces a whole series of woes against the Pharisees for being hypocrites, descendants of those who murder the prophets, calls them you snakes, you brood of vipers. Um, this is from Luke. Um, the Jewish people have always been killing God's prophets. Therefore, this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets. So, sort of intergenerational Jewish unfaithfulness and intergenerational Jewish guilt for past sins, a very dangerous idea that has devastating consequences centuries and centuries later. Then from the Gospel of John, Jesus saying to the Jewish leaders, you belong to your father, the devil, and you carry out his desires. Uh, And then we get passages like this one. The kingdom of God will be taken away from you, the Jewish people, the Jewish leaders, and given to a people who will produce its fruit. This is what's called replacement theology. The church replaces the Jewish community as God's people. Then, key in Christian anti-Semitism was the passion narratives. All four Gospels blame the Jews for the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, historically, we know that only the Romans had the authority to crucify someone. So the Romans were obviously heavily involved. And yet, the way the Gospels tell the story, they place most of the blame on the Jewish people. And repeatedly, Pilate finds Jesus innocent, wants to free him, but the Jewish leaders, the Jewish people just demand, no, you have to crucify him. So in Matthew's version, then Pilate, gets a bowl of water and washes his hands. I'm innocent of his blood. It's your responsibility. And all the people answered, his blood is on us and on our children. And if Matthew had known how much suffering these words would have caused in later centuries, I'm sure he would have never written his gospel this way. Because centuries later, all Jewish people forever were blamed for the crucifixion of Jesus. The blood of Jesus was always on the Jewish people and their children. Stephen's speech from the book of Acts. Intergenerational Jewish faith unfaithfulness. They're always rejecting God's prophets, the people that God, the messengers that God sends to them, and now they have betrayed and murdered even Jesus. Uh, and from the Pauline literature, uh, Jewish people are persecutors of the prophets of old, and then of Jesus, and then of the church of Jesus. And as a result, the wrath of God has come upon them at last. We'll skip this one. Um, and then we get passages like this. Jesus is the only way of salvation. And that means that Judaism then is discounted as a way of salvation, and the church and Christianity replace Judaism. And Judaism is then, consigned to the dustbin of history. So here are the major themes that we see in the New Testament that then get developed in later Christian anti-Semitism. The Jewish leadership is hypocritical, corrupt. Do not trust them. The Jews are opponents and persecutors of Jesus, of the church, and of God's purposes as they unfold through first the prophets, then Jesus, and the church. Jews bear collective responsibility for rejecting and crucifying Jesus. And the Jews of the New Testament period embody Old Testament unfaithful Israel. In other words, Jewish immorality and rejection of God's ways persists over time. Jesus provides the unique access, the only and unique access to the God of the Jewish scriptures. So Jewish ways of understanding scripture are thereby discounted. And so it's Jesus who continues and fulfills the Old Testament story, not the synagogue and not Judaism. And because the Jews largely continue to reject Jesus, God's concern shifts to the Gentiles. And a church that's composed mostly of Gentile believers replaces Israel, Judaism as God's covenant people. That's what's called supersessionism. Okay, uh, these are some pretty harsh themes. So it's helpful to set them in context a little bit and explain a little bit. Wow, why this harshness? The early church was a struggling religious community, and it's the younger sibling of the Jewish community, which is an ancient, large, well-established religious community, something like 5 to 7 million Jews in the Roman Empire. And the church is the upstart younger sibling that starts from a place of weakness and vulnerability. And one of the ways that it seeks to establish itself is to critique and differentiate itself from its older, uh, from the sibling. So the church and synagogue, they both have the same parent, right? Their parent for both of them, their parent is the Old Testament story, Israel, Judaism, and both claim that they have the rights to the entire inheritance, and they don't want to share it. So the church says, we fulfill that Old Testament story. And the synagogue says, no, we fulfill and continue that Old Testament story. And of course, the two communities are competing for adherence. And so by the time that the New Testament is written, there's already decades of conflict between Judaism and this emerging Christian community. And so when the New Testament is written, the writers highlight the conflict between the two communities. At the same time, it's really important to remember that most of the New Testament writers were Jews. And they were always very, very grateful for their Jewish scriptures, their Jewish heritage, and their Jewish identity. And Judaism was a big tent community. And there were many, many different versions of Judaism. So early on, the church still saw itself within that Jewish tent. And the church was one version of Judaism. And so you take Paul, for example, who never stopped being Jewish, but he was a Jewish follower of Messiah Jesus. So, okay, so what happens after the New Testament? There are significant developments. The church begins to define itself more and more over against Jews and Judaism. We are different than they are. And as a result, anti-Judaism becomes more and more deeply woven into the fabric and self-understanding of the church. Christian supersessionism becomes entrenched. Jews rejected Jesus, therefore they forfeited their role as God's people, which means that the church has replaced Judaism, which means that all of the Old Testament promises now apply to the church, not to the synagogue. And Jews, they're no longer part of God's agenda, and they're consigned to the dustbin of history. In fact, they stand under God's judgment. And the church develops a Christ-centered way and a Christological way of interpreting the Old Testament. It finds Jesus everywhere in the Old Testament, and this proves that Israel's story, the Old Testament, leads to Jesus and the church, not the synagogue. And the fact that the Jewish community doesn't accept this Christological interpretation just shows how blind and hard-hearted they are, and that they're always opposed to God's good purposes. And so the vilification of Jewish people and their leaders intensifies, um, and Judaism stands under God's judgment, and some Christian leaders begin to say that the church is called to help enact God's judgment on the synagogue. And a variety of church leaders begin to gather all of their anti-Jewish sayings and publish them. And then this sort of against the Jews tradition develops. So already in the year 200, this leader by the name of Tertullian writes a pamphlet against the Jews. And then, if, it goes on, and then you get John Chrysostom's sermons. So this very problematic Christian anti-Semitism develops very early in the church's history. And then there is a development that makes this anti-Semitic theology literally deadly for Jewish people. In the year 312, there was an emperor by the name of Constantine who converted to Christian faith. And he made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And it took a while for that to take hold because there were an emperor or two after him yet that were not Christian and tried to reverse the process. But within 100 years, Christianity was the well-established religion of the Roman Empire. That system where you get the merging of Christian faith and political power is called Constantinianism, also Christendom. And this system proved so durable that it survived the fall of the Roman Empire, and it became, in a sense, the dominant political reality in Europe until the 1800s. And there's still reflexes of that. I mean, in England, the King of England is still the official head of the Anglican Church. Like, what? That's because of Constantine. So, under Constantinianism or Christendom, there's a unity of church and state. Christianity is the official religion of the state. That means that the state has a divine mandate to support the church with special privileges, finances, to suppress heretics, and to promote Christian faith in whichever ways it can. The payback is that the church supports the empire and provides justification for the empire, which means that if you revolt against the emperor, you are revolting against God, because the emperor is God's agent. And because of infant baptism, there's a complete overlap between citizenship and church membership. Christendom has absolutely devastating consequences for Jewish people. Jews are not Christians. They're not citizens. They don't merit protection of the state, which means that Christian mobs have total impunity. They can attack Jews, Jewish homes, Jewish synagogues, loot, steal, uh, and the state will, in most cases, do nothing to protect Jews. Uh, and the state has a mandate to promote Christian faith. It has an obligation then to persecute Jews. Um, and what happens is that the church's anti-Semitic theology, the kind of horrible theology that John Chrysostom and others developed, it becomes social policy. And political leaders begin to treat Jews in keeping with what the church teaches about Jews. And so, the Christian anti-Semitic rhetoric begins to have deadly social consequences. And the church develops a theology that, well, uh, we must allow Jews to survive because, well, they keep the Old Testament alive, and the Old Testament testifies that Jesus is the Christ. However, we must not allow Jewish people to thrive. They must suffer because they're evil, for one thing, and also as an object lesson. This will be your fate if you refuse to acknowledge the truth of Christian faith. And so that became the dominant perspective of Christendom and the church. And I've spent quite a bit of time here talking about the first centuries of the church because this is when the really, really important developments happened. And uh, during the first 400-500 years. And what happened after is that there weren't a whole lot of changes for the next 12, 1300 years. Um, but just before we look at the specific forms, the specific kinds of persecution of Jews under Christendom, I just want to sort of jump ahead over 1,000 years, just very briefly, because because this anti-Semitic theology developed when there was one Roman Catholic Church, and of course Protestants like to blame Roman Catholics for all that's bad about Christendom and Christianity. Um, but just want to jump ahead and look very briefly at Martin Luther, sort of the one who kicked off the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Um, as Luther's as Luther got older, he got more cranky and he became more and more harsh towards Jewish people, and his writings are just laced with anti-Semitic rhetoric. Um, Jewish people epitomize ungodliness, opposition to God's purposes because they refuse to recognize Jesus as God's Messiah. And towards the end of his career, Luther published a tract called The Jews and Their Lies, which pulls together most of the medieval negative stereotypes about Jews. And Luther says things like Jews are truly stupid fools. They're full of the devil's feces. They are devil's children damned to hell. They're a calamity in our midst. Um, by the way, that tract, The Jews and Their Lies, the Nazis republished it in the 1930s as part of their propaganda efforts against the Jews. Luther called Christians to burn Jewish homes and synagogues and schools because that's where the Jewish people commit their sins, confiscate Jewish books and destroy them, prevent Jewish people from praying and teaching, and expel Jews from the country if they refuse to convert. So Protestantism didn't spell any better times for the Jewish people. I think I'll just pause there, and we can take a few minutes for any questions about this early period of Christian history. And then, after we take a bit of time for questions, I'm going to look at, okay, so what were some of the concrete forms of that persecution of Jews took in all of the centuries under Christendom? So, any questions, comments about anything we've covered so far? Feel free to use the raise hand function, or just unmute yourself and speak up.
That's an awful lot of information to kind of wrap around and digest. So I think people are probably thinking about it.
Yeah, and it's not very pleasant information to have to wrap our heads around, right? This is one of the saddest features of our Christian past. And I think it's part of our Christian past that we as a contemporary church have not begun to confess and grapple with adequately. It is a really ugly, um, ugly part of our past. Yeah. And one of the points I'm going to make is that Christian anti-Semitism is a gift that just keeps on giving and giving and giving, and the consequences of Christian anti-Semitism just play out right into our own time. But we'll get to that story.
Joyce
Joyce.
has a question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I grew up on prairies in Saskatchewan, and I had no idea why people hated the Jews. There were so few in Regina. I mean, you wouldn't, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
You just never saw any. I didn't know why they were so hated. And then we moved to Montreal, and when I got a job in a Pepsi Cola company, there was a really nice girl in that office. She's very sweet and very easy to talk to, and I really was taking to her. And then I found out she was a Jew. And I was surprised. I was kind of scared because I didn't know what I should do. I wanted to be friends with her. There was no reason for me not to be, but it was really a troubling time for me.
Yeah,
So
because yeah, that Christian anti-Semitism was still there.
they're
Yeah.
affecting me, and I didn't know
Hmm.
even why people were hating the Jews. Of course,
Hmm.
you can get any number of movies about people who helped the Jews during the war.
Hmm.
I think Corey Ten Boom was the best one of all who really
Hmm.
made it public that
Hmm.
you don't you
Yeah.
don't hate Jews. You help
Hmm.
them.
But of course, people like Corey Ten Boom are very, very much the exception. The vast, vast majority of Christians facilitated the Holocaust in
Yeah.
Europe. I mean, in the Christians in Germany especially. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, they're big supporters of the Nazis. Yeah.
If I can share something, I'm from Montreal originally. My mom grew up in Montreal, and actually, she taught us kids to really not be racist at all about anybody. And she told us stories that she skied in the Laurentians in the 1940s, and she told us kids when we skied in I grew up in Dorval. She said, I remember going to various resorts with her parents or her friends, and it said no Jews allowed. So that would be she was born in
Yep.
1923. So it'd be the 30s, it'd be maybe
Hmm.
before the war. That made an impact on us kids. And
Hmm.
I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional because I grew up not being anti anybody
Hmm.
with that. And she also said that she told us in Montreal that the Jews were very are prominent business people always have been in Montreal and Quebec, very well known, very well liked. But she said they had a neighbor, a little boy down the street, who was a Jewish friend, and sorry, I'm getting emotional talking about my mom, but she made a point of us knowing this, which was interesting for us. So thanks for listening.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there were lots of in prior to the Holocaust. There were, like here in Manitoba, there were cottage communities where Jews were not welcome. There were clubs where Jews were not welcome. And I think that kind of thing was the case across Canada. And that's because of this legacy of Christian anti-Semitism. Yeah. Well, let's go on, and we'll have lots of opportunity yet to engage with this. Um, yeah, I'm going to share my screen again here. And I'm not going to get into the details, but I'm going to, oh yeah, here we are. Talk about some of the forms that Christian anti-Semitism took under Christendom. Now, these things that I mentioned, not all of them happened everywhere at all times, right? It depended on the location, depended on the time, depended on the local ruler, depended on the local bishop, those kinds of things. But all of these things that I'm going to mention happened often and way too often. Demonization. And here's a big one. Jews were Christ killers and God killers because they were responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. I was at an event, just over a year ago, and a Jewish person was there sharing his experience. He was a young man in his early 30s. And, in school, there was a kid who called him a Christ killer. Um, okay, Jews were often accused of, they'd steal the communion host and then they would desecrate it. There was a particular accusation called the blood libel. And this meant that at around Easter and Passover kind of overlap, that Jewish people would kidnap a Christian baby, kill that baby, and from the blood, they would take the blood and mix it into their Passover bread. It's ridiculous, but Jewish people were executed. So if a Christian baby or child died close to Passover, Good Friday time, woe to the local Jewish community because it was quite likely that somebody would get arrested and killed for that.
Wow.
All kinds of vulgar depictions of Jews, pictures of Jewish rabbis sticking their head up a pig's butt looking for their scriptures. That was in the artwork. Okay, scapegoating. Jewish people were blamed for all kinds of things. They poisoned wells. When the bubonic plague swept through Europe and killed, 30-40% of the population in many places, there were lots of places where Jews were blamed for causing the plague. And there were some places where thousands of Jews, entire Jewish communities, were just slaughtered because they had caused the bubonic plague. Um, they were often blamed for usury, economic exploitation. Jews were not allowed to own land. They were not allowed to engage in a lot of occupations. So, business and finance was one of the few occupations they were allowed to engage in. And then they were blamed for taking high levels of interest. And they were always trying to destroy the church. Um, Economic restrictions. Um, Jews were not allowed to own farmland or property in many places. They couldn't go to Christian universities, and those were the only universities there were. Lots of types of employment were not open to Jews. There was a deliberate, you remember, we have to make Jews suffer and keep them poor. So there was a kind of enforced poverty. Political social restrictions. So Jews were not citizens. That means that they were vulnerable. Christian mobs could attack Jewish homes, synagogues, loot, steal with impunity. In many places, Jews were forced to live in ghettos. That means that a certain part of the town or city was reserved for Jews. There would be a wall around it with gates going in and out, and movement of people and goods was strictly controlled. The idea was that Jews are kind of like a virus or a poison, and you have to keep them contained so that they don't infect the broader community. The ghetto in Rome lasted until about the year 1900. Not every city had ghettos, but many did. In some places, Jews had to wear peculiar clothing that identified they're Jewish so that they could be ridiculed. This is where the Star of David comes from, that the Nazis made Jewish people use, where there was religious persecution. Often there were forced conversions. Jewish babies would sometimes be kidnapped, baptized, raised in Christian families. Jewish books, synagogues burned. Christian mob violence, looting, attacking, beating, killing individual Jews, stealing property. Sometimes, a charismatic priest or monk would stir up the crowds, and a mob would run off and attack the local Jews. Holy Week was always the most dangerous time for Jews because in Holy Week, the church focused on the cross and the suffering of Jesus. And that's when the idea of Jews are Christ killers really came up, and Holy Week, Jews were especially vulnerable. Entire cities and countries expelled their entire Jewish communities, and one of the motives for doing that was that the state would then confiscate their property. So, Bavaria in
Hmm.
Germany expelled all its Jews in the year 1276. England expelled all its Jews in the year 1290. France, 1306. City of Naples, 1288. Hungary, 1316. The biggest expulsion was from Spain in the year that Columbus sailed, 1492. About 150,000 Jewish people were expelled from Spain. They were given the option, either you convert, become Christian, or you have to leave. Of course, there were a lot of phony conversions, but also a lot of people left. And then there were large-scale massacres of entire Jewish communities. During the bubonic plague, entire communities were massacred. The Christian Crusades were especially hard on Jewish communities. As the Crusaders gathered in Northern Europe and they were going to march off to the Holy Land to fight the Muslims, the enemies of God, well, why not? And on your way, why not attack the enemies of God that you encounter in the Jewish community? So entire Jewish communities were slaughtered by the Crusaders. And then in the Russian Empire, earlier on, the areas in the Russian Empire, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus, those areas, um, they had been more tolerant of Jewish people, so lots of Jews had moved there. Then things changed in the 1800s, and anti-Semitism spiked, and there were widespread attacks on Jewish people. And so in the late 1800s, early 1900s, well over 1 million Jewish people fled the Russian Empire. A lot of them moved to the States, some to Canada, others to other places in Europe. So, as I said, not all of these things happened everywhere all the time, but all of them happened very, very often, far too often. So, what happens then in the modern period? Okay, 19th, 20th centuries, Europe abandons Christendom, well, and becomes quite secular. And for a while, there is significant improvement for the Jewish people in the 18th centuries as a result of growing respect for individual freedoms, human rights, freedom of religion. Uh, and Jewish societies were more tolerant, gave Jews more opportunity, and Jewish people very quickly made use of those opportunities, got an education, became prominent in fields of medicine, art, literature, culture, business, and all kinds of other things. However, there was this, Christian-inspired hatred and fear of the Jews that was just deeply embedded in European culture, and it got secularized. It morphed or evolved. And in the 1800s, the 1800s saw the rise of political parties whose major sort of platform was the Jews are terrible people and we have to get rid of them. Um, so the reason Jews were in secular anti-Semitism, Jews are no longer blamed for being Christ killers, but they're blamed for things like being economically exploitative, or they're trying to take over the world economy for their own benefits, or their blood is defective and they will be poison within the German race. Those kinds of horrible race theories start to develop. Um, and then, of course, this secular anti-Semitism, it culminates in the Holocaust. And how much does one blame Christianity, the history of Christian anti-Semitism for the Holocaust? That's a tough one to assess. But personally, I can't help but believe that the Holocaust would never have happened had there not been had the soil not been prepared by centuries and centuries of Christian hatred and fear of Jews. Um, so that's very, very sobering.
Certainly is.
Let's pause there for a bit, and then I'm going to end my screen share here. Let's stop there for some conversation, and then we're going to talk about how does all this impact, how does this Christian anti-Semitism impact very, very significantly developments in Palestine. But your thoughts, reflections, feeling, whatever, questions, whatever you'd like to contribute here. And I recognize, I mean, this is, yeah, this is a very, very sobering story, and yeah.
Did Luther have a bad time with the? Did he have a bad experience with the Jewish people?
Okay, Luther was prone to blame as much as he could on the Catholic Church. And so early in his career, Luther thought, oh, the reason that all Jews have not converted to Christianity is because the Catholic Church presents such a poor picture of Christianity that why would they convert? Because the Catholic Church provides such a horrible model of Christianity. No one would convert by looking at the Catholic Church. But now he is recovering the true Christian faith, and Luther thought that once Jewish people understood his version of the Christian faith, that they would just convert in droves. When that didn't happen, Luther, I don't know that full story, but later in his life, that made him very, very bitter, and he turned against the Jewish people with a vengeance.
I have all his sermons, and I think he's a great preacher, but I didn't know he was that bad towards the Jewish people.
Yeah, Luther was known as a great preacher, and Luther made enormous contributions. And so personally, I feel very indebted to Martin Luther. But good people sometimes do some horrible things, and that is a real uh, what Luther said about the Jews is one of the really ugly parts of Luther's legacy and Luther's theology.
Well, not only plagued with hatred towards the Jews, but it's been hatred towards the Black people, hatred toward, well, I can remember the vast number of Ukrainian people that came to Canada in the late 30s.
Mm-hmm.
The neighbors certainly weren't welcoming to them, just because they're different people, I guess. But there was nothing like people weren't killing them, thankfully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that unfortunately, as human beings, we have this sad habit of othering. We other people, right? So that people who are not like us for in whatever way, we other them, they're different than us, and then we discriminate against them, we have prejudices against them, and treat them in some pretty nasty ways. You just have to look at what's going on south of the border to see that in all its ugly glory. Um, and people debate is anti-Semitism like every other racial prejudice? I mean, obviously, there's way too many racial prejudices against black people, against Ukrainians, against da 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 da. Um, is anti-Semitism just like every other racial prejudice, or is it different? My own take on that is. Um, all racial prejudices have some similarities, but each one is also unique. And each situation is unique. And I think anti-Semitism is particularly unique, partly because of its Christian roots, partly because of how long it has lasted, and partly because of its devastating consequences. I mean, how many forms of racial prejudice have led to something like the Holocaust, the murder of 5 to 6 million people of that particular group? So there, yeah, anti-Semitism has similarities to every other racial prejudice, but there's also some very significant unique features.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to remember that, of course, the Crusaders, I mean, everyone who was different from them was slaughtered. There were huge slaughters of the Greek Orthodox in what was then Constantinople. Of course, they were also slaughtering the Muslims and the Jews as well. So anyone who was different from themselves got the edge of their sword. I think it's also important to remember that, for example, when the Jews were expelled from Spain, they crossed over the Straits of Gibraltar and ended up in Morocco. Now, they didn't have the same kind of equality that the Muslims had there, but they certainly had a better time than they did under the Christians. And certain Jewish scholars like Maimonides and so on were recognized and had very high positions, for example, in the Islamic regime in Egypt in the Middle Ages. So whilst I say that they were Jews were not recognized fully as equals in Islamic states, they certainly were treated better. There was a large community of Jews in Iraq who lived there quite happily until the state of Israel was formed, and then they were told to leave. So we don't stand up very well in comparison with the way in which the Muslims have treated the Jews. And if you talk to older people who grew up in Palestine, who can still remember what it was like before the state of Israel, I mean, many of them will talk about the way in which Jews and Muslims lived together and shared in supporting one another's festivals. Even to this day, the Copts during Ramadan will provide tables of food for the fasting Muslims. So, you know, we need to remember the behavior of another religion towards the Jews.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mervyn. Yeah, it's well known that on the whole, Jewish communities fared much, much better in Muslim societies than they did in Christian Europe. And that is a really sad commentary on our Christian faith and background. And when Jews were expelled from Spain, many of them found refuge in North Africa, Muslim countries in North Africa, as well as I've heard that the Ottoman Empire based in Turkey took in quite a few because they realized that these Jews would make good citizens who would make significant contributions. Yeah. And it's interesting that now in the Muslim world, there's some pretty significant anti-Semitism, but that has been largely fueled by the formation of the State of Israel.
Yeah.
And that Jews were quite safe and did quite well in Muslim countries up until the formation of the State of Israel, which Muslim people saw as such an imposition and such an insult to Islam, and that sparked a lot of anti-Semitism. But Cynthia, I see your hand is up. Oops.
Hi, yes, yeah. Hi, good evening.
Oh.
Again, fabulous presentation. And I just want to thank you for the years of study and research that you've done to bring this all together and bring to light. I don't know what we would do with people without people like you who
Well,
this is just not stuff that we learn in school or even know to dig and research on our own. So I want to thank you first and foremost for that.
Yeah.
well, thanks. Thank you.
The second is I guess maybe I'm just getting ahead of where you want to go, but it's sad to me to see that the that Israel is sort of doing to others what was done to them, and
Yeah.
that I guess it just speaks to that intergenerational trauma that you hurt people, hurt others, and it's very sad. You know, you think that perhaps there would be compassion that come out of people, but it seems that the human heart is set to, if you hurt me, then I will hurt you. You know, which is just very heartbreaking.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that. You know, I'm reminded of those biblical verses in Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, often in the passages where God commands the people to be kind to widows, orphans, sojourners. God says, "Remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt." And it's all about remember your trauma. And for us as human beings, there are different ways of remembering our trauma. We can remember our trauma in a way that I'm furious, and when I get my chance, I'm going to get my revenge. And these biblical passages say, remember your pain and suffering, remember your trauma, but let that trauma soften your heart. And let that trauma make you compassionate, and let that trauma open your eyes to the suffering of the widows, the orphans, the refugees in your midst, the weak and the vulnerable, right? So, as human beings, we have choices about how we will remember our trauma. But it's not always easy to remember our trauma in a way that makes us compassionate because there's a deep, deep human impulse to get our revenge. Okay, I think that's a good segue to move to, okay, so how has all this anti-Semitism, how has it had a profound impact on developments in Palestine? Okay, here we go. Here we go. Okay. The anti-Semitism that made Europe unsafe for Jews, it inspired the Zionist movement, right? This movement, late 1800s among Jews in Europe, to argue we need to create our own Jewish state in Palestine. It's the only way that we can guarantee safety for Jewish people. And so it was this anti-Semitism that was a huge factor in fueling Zionist settler colonialism in Palestine, that then eventually ended up dispossessing Palestinians. And the Holocaust was this absolute watershed moment in multiple different ways. Because prior to the Holocaust, the vast majority of Jews did not support the Zionist cause. I mentioned those over 1 million Jews that fled the Russian Empire when there were these persecutions of Jewish people. Less than 1% of those Jews moved to Palestine. So the Zionist movement did not have a lot of traction. Everything changed with the Holocaust. And Jewish communities worldwide began to support the state of Israel in a big, big way. So that today, for many, many Jewish people, the state of Israel is just fundamental to their faith, their identity. Okay. The Holocaust also changed Western political perspectives. So the Western nations were happy to vote at the United Nations in support of, well, yes, let the Zionists create a Jewish state. It solves the Jewish problem. It's where Jewish refugees can go, and it's not going to cost us anything. And so this Jewish state was then created on land that, of course, belonged to Palestinians. And it was the land that Palestinians wanted for the creation of their own state. And of course, it was their homeland where they had lived for well over 1,000 years. So the Zionists had this deep, deep seated fear of anti-Semitism, and that shaped so much of what they did. So they wanted to create an explicitly Jewish state where Jews would be in charge, and that meant getting rid of Palestinians. So then 1947, 48, they committed the Nakba. Jewish forces killed hundreds, if not thousands, of Palestinians, and just forced 1 million of them out of their homes, farms, $750,000 were just simply forced across the borders. Um, and Israel, to this day, never admits this huge human atrocity and this massive land grab and land theft and ethnic cleansing operation that it carried out. But that whole process was driven by this fear of anti-Semitism. A new Holocaust can break out at any time, and the only way to protect ourselves is to create this Jewish state that has the minimum number of Palestinians in it. Christian anti-Semitism is the gift that just keeps on giving, unfortunately. So, Palestinians, they've been resisting the Zionist settler colonial project from the very beginning. Their resistance is often framed as anti-Semitism. Because of the collective fear and trauma from the Holocaust, from the long history of anti-Semitism, Israel typically responds to Palestinian resistance with brutal retaliation. That's intended as a deterrent. Uh, that's what we currently see in Gaza and the West Bank. And what happens is that Palestinian resistance gets Nazified. So the Palestinians, if they resist Israeli land grabbing, Israeli settler colonialism violently, they are portrayed as the new Nazis who are once again out to get Jewish people. There's an Israeli saying, never again. And it means okay, in Europe, most Jewish people were quite passive in the face of the Nazi threat. The state of Israel has said we will.
You've gone silent again, Dan.
Dan, check your mute button.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, it says my internet connection is unstable. Um, okay, I'm going to try sharing again, see if it works now. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. Um, so, never again is this significant Israeli saying. In October of 2023, when President Netanyahu was announcing the ground invasion of Gaza, in his speech, he said, "We have always said never again. Never again is now. Never again is now." Think of what he's doing here rhetorically. Never again will we allow another Holocaust. Never again is now. He is portraying Hamas's October 7th attack as another Nazi attack on the Jewish people. It's another attempted Holocaust. That's what I mean about Palestinian resistance gets Nazified. And if it gets Nazified, then the most vicious destruction of that Nazi threat is legitimate. Uh, and you know, if one is not Jewish, I think it's difficult, if not impossible, to imagine the experience of Jewish fear. The level of trauma and fear because of what 1700 years of anti-Semitism and then the Holocaust. And the fear that another Holocaust could break out at any time. Therefore, Jewish people must support the state of Israel at all cost. And therefore, when Israel is attacked or challenged in any way, it must respond with vicious brute force. Uh, That's what we see happening here. And this is also what makes Hamas's tactics and its attack on October 7th so counterproductive, because it just feeds into this narrative that Palestinians are inherently anti-Semitic, they're out to get us, and Hamas is like the Nazis, and they want to slaughter all Jewish people. So Hamas's actions on October 7th just fit into that stereotype and that narrative. Okay.
I have a question.
Oh, yes.
I just was thinking of that the War of 1967 when Jews went into the land or in some part of the area that was, I assume, Palestinian,
Right.
and took the country back, and at least that's the way it came across. But I mean, what has that done to today's borders? I'm not just sure what they took back.
In 1967, Israel conquered the West Bank, which belonged to Jordan at the time,
Yeah.
and it was completely occupied by Palestinian people. And since 1967, Israel has been filling the West Bank with Jewish-only settlements,
Yeah.
and trying to push Palestinians off the land. In 1967, Israel also conquered Gaza, which up until that time had belonged to Egypt. Um, and Gaza is, of course, filled with descendants of refugees from Israel's ethnic cleansing and land theft in 1948 and 49.
Huh, my
Yeah.
goodness.
So anti-Semitism as the Christian anti-Semitism as the gift that keeps on giving. Today, the accusation of anti-Semitism is leveled at individuals, movement, and groups that advocate on behalf of Palestinians. So the accusation of anti-Semitism gets weaponized. That's the term that's used. It becomes an attempt to discredit and shut down critiques of Zionism, of the State of Israel, and shut down Western solidarity with Palestinians. So the student encampments in the summer of 2024 were often labeled anti-Semitic, or rallies calling for a ceasefire or an end to Israel's genocide in Gaza have often been called anti-Semitic. So the anti-Semitic story, it just goes on and on and on, and it has Christian anti-Semitism has had so many tragic consequences for Jewish people, of course, but now it's just having such tragic consequences for Palestinian people. And the genocide in Gaza would not be happening had it not been for this history of Christian anti-Semitism.
Well, that Gaza Strip will never be, uh, it will never be a place for anybody to live because it's so badly torn up.
Yeah, and it's hard, like, yeah, what's the future of the Gaza Strip? That's just unimaginable. I can't imagine that Israel will allow concrete rebar and all the equipment needed to rebuild Gaza. So what's going to happen? I mean, the goal of Israel is to find some other country that will take all the Palestinians and then it will expel them all from Gaza. But until now, I mean, no other country is willing to take 2 million refugees. So they're stuck in limbo. And in Gaza, they'll be in limbo for a long time.
Yes, it's terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions, reflections, thoughts?
Of course, I mean, the Jews can, in fact, point to a period where, in fact, there was a relationship between the Islamic leadership in Jerusalem and the Nazis. There were major riots in the 1936 to 39, before the Second World War, against the Jewish settlers. And the major leader of that was what was called the Mufti of Jerusalem, who was, of course, the most significant leader of the Muslim people in Palestine. And he did, in fact, go to the Nazis in Berlin and seek their assistance.
Mhm.
But I mean, that ended with the Second World War. And it's interesting that, I mean, today at least, Israel does not consider that all Arabs are anti-Semitic.
Mhm.
After all, there is a major effort going on to bring about what is called the Abraham Accords. And some of the Gulf states are part of that. Morocco is part of that. Egypt is part of that. Jordan, of course, has been part of that for some time. So it's not necessarily just an generally anti-Arab thing. It is particularly the Palestinians that this slur is made about. The Palestinians will remind Western nations that under the United Nations Charter, that any country which is being invaded or occupied by a foreign power has the right of resistance, just as the French had the right of resistance in the Second World War, and the Finns had the right of resistance against the Russians. They say, well, why does that not apply to us? Why are we then called terrorists when we simply exercise a right that is provided for us in the charter that is supposed to be uniting of humankind across the globe? So that's some of the things I think also to bear in mind.
Yeah, and that fits with what I said last week about settler colonialism. One of the strategies of settler colonialism is to erase the indigenous people physically and also sort of rhetorically. And one of the ways that the Zionist movement does that is Palestinians don't have a right to resist because they're not a people. There's a famous saying by Golda Meir, former prime minister of Israel, that says, "There's no such thing as a Palestinian people," right? So you erase them. So if there's no such thing as a real Palestinian people, then they've got no right to resist us. And in fact, in Israel, in Israeli rhetoric, you don't talk about Palestinians, you talk about Arabs.
Yes.
Israel talks about the Arabs. Because if you talk about Palestinians, that locates them in the land, and that gives them some claim to the land. But if you call them Arabs, you've just erased them. They're just part of the larger Arab thing. And one of the rhetorical speaking points of the Zionist movement is that, well, come on, the Arab nations, the Arab peoples, they have something like 22 countries, and we just have one. So, let these Arabs just move there. There's lots of countries for the Arabs to go to, but we just have one small Jewish state. So, erasure, yeah.
The Palestinian people are resilient, and the Gaza people are willing to rebuild even if they build with their own bare hands. They're hard workers, they're resilient, they're smart, but they need support.
Yeah.
They can't live on their own. I hope Turkey will interfere. Nobody is standing up for their human rights. If this happened to Canada, for instance, some other nation came to destroy us, other countries will come and rescue us. But nobody came to rescue Gaza.
Yeah, there's a deep-seated racism in the West towards Palestinians. A deep-seated racism. That Palestinians are just not worth as much as white Europeans or as Jewish people. And so the West does not value Palestinians. Wonderful book by Omar El Kurd, Egyptian-born American journalist now. He wrote a book called Someday Everyone Will Have Been Against This. Wonderful title. Someday everyone will have been against this. So he talks about the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. Now everybody was against apartheid in South Africa. When the struggle was being waged, that wasn't the case at all, right? And so what this book points out is Western hypocrisy and Western racism. That, you know, the West stands for human rights for all, but that's a bunch of nonsense. It just means we protect our own political and economic interests, but we certainly don't care about vulnerable people in other parts of the world, especially in Palestine. Yeah, so there's a deep-seated racism. Oh yeah, and you mentioned Palestinian resilience. Yeah, there's an Arabic word often used by Palestinians called sumud. And sumud means steadfastness, stubbornness. We're just going to hang in there no matter what. You're not pushing us off the land. Endurance, it means all of those. So yeah, Palestinians have an incredible sumud. And they just resist and hang in there despite enormous pressure.
Well, there's a special day in the Palestinian calendar called Land Day.
Okay.
And I mean, I've attended various events around Land Day. In fact, I've been a speaker at Land Day. And I mean, yes, very strongly supported, and it's a remembrance of what has happened over the years, and a determination to retain the land. I was in a work camp in 1956 in the city of Dresden. Dresden was, the whole center of Dresden was totally destroyed by an enormous fireball. People jumped into the fountains and were boiled alive. But after the war, it was, of course, rebuilt, in fact, with Russian help. But so places, if as people have mentioned, if there is the will, if there is the resources made available, people will rebuild.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There is so much for us to digest from this presentation. Thank you. It's 8:29.
Oh, right.
Shall we regroup next week?
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much, Cindy, for bringing us to be aware of the way the time's going. But I think that is an indication of the kind of absorbing impact that this presentation has had upon us. And it's interesting in the way in which, in fact, so many of the comments have related to present day events. So I think we're getting the connections very strongly. So Dan, thank you very much again for a very, very stimulating, sobering presentation. I think we're having difficulty in absorbing and digesting, coming to terms with what you've been saying. Again, I want to thank Cindy, whose voice you've heard from time to time. Cindy McQuaid is the host for our program. And just to once again mention that these presentations are being recorded. We had a discussion, the three of us, earlier on about accessing these recordings, and we decided that if anybody wants to use these recordings, Dan is very happy for them to do so, and they could be accessed by contacting the office at St. John's, info at stjohns.ca. So continue to mention these programs to your families and friends. I think even though, of course, there's been a lot of information in the first session, a lot in this, it'll still be worthwhile coming into the third session, and that of course will be this coming Monday evening at the same time. So thank you very much, and let's hope the Blue Jays do well.
That's right. Oh yeah. That's right. Okay.
Oh, brother.
Good night now. Good night.
Right, thank you.
You're welcome.